To say the Chevy Bolt EUV has sputtered out of the gate is a pretty serious understatement. This thing, it was supposed to come out late last year as a sort of complementary model to the Bolt EV that came out a few years ago. Forget the name confusion, we will get to that a little later. But then a battery recall affecting literally every Bolt ever made put the rollout of this thing on hold. Fast forward about a year and there's a fix in, which means you can buy a Bolt again. So now it's time to find out whether it was worth the wait for this slightly bigger version. For more expert car reviews, don't forget to share our channel and subscribe so you can catch some of this and maybe even a little of that. As far as EV-related PR disasters go, I'd have to think that this situation was up there with the whole Volkswagen debacle. And yes, I know battery fires are dangerous, bad, and nothing to joke about, while bad jokes are, well, bad jokes. But I'm speaking more broadly because people are still so skeptical of electrification. So a bunch of battery fires definitely ain't gonna help. Now, since you're watching this, I'm going to assume that you're at least a little more open-minded, but in case you still are a little bit apprehensive or wary of what's going on, here's what I can tell you. The situation started with apparently the batteries overheating when they were charged above 90%. So while GM was trying to figure out what was going on, it put in some measures to try to prevent that from happening. Set a charge limit, don't let it go above 90%. Park outdoors during and after charging just in case. Yeah, it might seem silly, but it did work, I think. It seemed to kind of prevent some fires. I know it was hard for some people. There were some complaints that they couldn't park far enough away from other cars. I don't know. I just know that GM did its best until it figured out that some of the battery packs had bad tabs, and I don't remember what they're called, but kind of like the layers in between. They're like these separators, and they would get folded, and that's what would lead to the overheating and potentially the fires. Now, once it figured it out, it replaced the modules in all of the existing customer cars before it started building new cars with good batteries, and that includes this one I am driving. So, if you're willing to trust the folks at GM and LG that all is good, well, what you're looking at is a pretty decent little electric vehicle. Even still, I am a big believer in hedging my bets, and I think you should too. So whether you're considering new or used, you can always head to the MyGM portal or just check with your dealer to make sure the specific vehicle you are looking at has had the recall work done. It's very easy to do. You can do that online. We'll go ahead and give you the URL, or you can just call your dealer and have them look up the VIN. You gotta punch in that VIN though. That's the way to do it for that extra layer of peace of mind. So let's say you're feeling good, or at least better than you were before, about the idea of driving a Bolt or a Bolt EUV. Well, there are still some pesky issues, but I do want to talk about price first because it's a couple grand more than the regular Bolt. It starts at about 42 grand before tax and yes, any government rebates, but it's also easy to price it above 50 grand, albeit barely. This one I'm driving, it's $51,000 before tax, but I gotta say, that's pretty competitive for what this is, especially if you look at it next to something like the Kia Soul EV, which really does make sense. That's probably its most obvious competitor in terms of size, what they do, the fact that they're both front-wheel drive. Well, this has a little bit more range, and I also think it's a little more practical. Starting with the platform it's built on, this is a dedicated battery electric platform. So if you take a look at that Soul, well, it started life as a gas vehicle. So it was designed that way, it was engineered that way, whereas this was designed to be a battery electric vehicle. So it means the very load floor is lower. Super easy to get in and out of this thing. I really do like it. I really like this extra little cutout too in the front doors. Right in those front footwells, you can see it's just super easy. I honestly think this is the easiest vehicle to get in and out of, and I'm not that old yet. So I do think that is good news for some shoppers who may be of advanced age, you're looking for something that's comfortable and easy to get in and out of. And then just overall, everything about this is easy to live with. I really do think it's a lot like the Volkswagen ID.4 in terms of when you get in and you start driving, it doesn't really feel any different than a similarly sized gas-powered vehicle. And speaking of size, I do want to point out, my bike is in the back. This is a 29er, an XL frame too. It is a big bike. And yes, I have this front passenger seat all the way forward, but I still have great outward visibility. I can see that passenger side mirror, no problem. And I've got my bike in here, and this is a pretty small car overall. So I am impressed with that packaging. The other thing I really like about it is you can option this thing with Super Cruise. That's GM's hands-free adaptive cruise control. So when you're out on the highway, designated, separated, divided highways, whatever you want to call it, you can hit this button here on the steering wheel, and as soon as this light goes green with the cruise control activated, you can let your hands off the wheel and it will do everything except change lanes on its own. Newer systems can do that. This is a little bit of an older one, so it can't do the auto lane changes, but it'll stay in its lane even through curves in the road. That to me really is the big sell here, and it's what sets the Bolt EUV apart from even more expensive EVs. So now let's get to the name. Remember back when Chevy decided to sell both the Volt and the Bolt, and people said it was confusing? Yeah, well, apparently no one in Detroit cared then, and they don't care now either, because you get to choose from the Bolt EV and the Bolt EUV. And really, they don't look that different from afar. The big giveaway here, these roof rails. They do add a bit of utility, as well as the lighting front and rear both changed. And there's something that looks at least a little bit more like a grille on this thing compared to the Bolt EV. But the biggest difference between them is the wheelbase has been stretched about 3 inches, and it all translates directly into 3 inches more legroom in the back. There is so much space to stretch out. The only issue, headroom for a tall guy like me. Now, for most of you, probably doesn't matter, but if you are shopping for something for your rideshare side hustle, that is worth noting. But otherwise, it's a pretty spacious little vehicle. Well, since we're out on the road, we may as well get back to talking about how it drives. And again, it is very good. It's very simple and approachable. Front wheel drive, which I know that means it's probably gonna fall off at least a couple of your shopping lists, but I definitely don't think it should. And that wouldn't be a reason to skip winter tires anyway. Winter's right around the corner. You definitely need winter rubber no matter where that torque is going, whether it's front wheel drive, rear wheel drive, or all-wheel drive. This one, well, it makes 200 horsepower and 266 pound-feet of torque. And that might not seem like much, especially when you compare it to other EVs out there. They are pushing a lot more output these days, but it's still plenty, again, in the context of this being a small front-wheel drive vehicle. Something else I really like, the regenerative braking. It's got proper one-pedal driving. So here I am, I'm rolling up to a stop sign, and it's gonna come to a stop without me even having to hit the brake pedal and use the physical brakes. There is this paddle here for regen on demand as well. So if you don't have the one pedal mode engaged, or you want to add a little bit more, maybe you didn't give yourself enough time to stop, if you just hit this paddle here, it'll give you a little bit more aggressive regenerative braking. And that does bring me to a point here about the Bolt EUV compared to the Bolt EV, because that one does have a little bit more range. This one's officially good for 397 kilometers, whereas that one is good for 417. Still a little low, though it is better than that Soul EV, the Nissan Leaf, some of those kind of older EVs that compete in this space. But honestly, I don't think 397 is too bad. But here's the bigger problem that I have, okay? I decided to put it to a little bit of a range test earlier this week, and I went from my place to London, Ontario and back, and door to door to downtown, it was 175 kilometers. That means 350 kilometers total, okay? And yes, that is pushing close to the maximum range, and yes, it was mostly on the highway, and that's where EVs do their worst, but that's kind of the point. okay? Because I get questions a lot. I was charging this thing the other day, and a guy stopped me to ask how far he could take it, especially on the highway. So I wanted to find out for myself, and I was very disappointed. Yes, it was cold, it was raining a little bit of headwind when I was on my way there, but still, I only managed 270 kilometers. And yes, I stopped at a DC fast charger. I still had 27 kilometers of range, so pushing up close to 300. But that's not very good. And the other problem, this thing, well, it maxes out at about 55 kilowatts on a fast charger. So not as fast as some of the more modern EVs out there. And that is a big problem too, because it means you're going to be stopped at those charging stations for an awful long time. Luckily for me, it was endless shrimp at Red Lobster, and there was one right across the road, so I was able to enjoy a nice long meal. But if you're in a hurry to get to where you're going, that's a little disappointing. Now, Chevy says you can add about 150 kilometers on a DC fast charger in about half an hour, but that is ideal conditions. It took me a little bit longer this morning. I was up above 40 minutes to add about that much to this battery pack. So that isn't super great, again, compared to more modern EVs out there. And then, well, if you got a 48 amp hookup at home, a level 2, it should take you about 7 hours. So you can easily do the job overnight. And then as far as the ride quality, well, again, it falls a little bit short of newer entries like the Kia EV6 or the Hyundai Ioniq 5. But again, those are a little bit more expensive, and that is noteworthy. The bigger problem I have this week, at least with this tester in particular, the build quality. Some of the creaks and rattles that I've been hearing this week, not great. And yes, in a kind of value pick, it's not so bad. Not much worse than the Tesla Model 3 I was in the day before I picked this thing up, but that's not the point. This is still a $40,000 to $50,000 car, so I expect a little bit more in terms of the tightness of the build quality. And even some of the plastics in here, not so nice, but otherwise, lots of great features. I've got this big, I think it's like a 10.1 inch touchscreen, wireless Apple CarPlay and Android Auto, heated front seats. I also want to point out, it's got Google Maps built in, of course, because of the Android Auto and the Apple CarPlay. I'm a big Apple CarPlay guy. I talk to you guys about that a lot. I usually talk about how much better it is than using any built-in navigation system, but this week I was proven wrong when I was on that drive out to London and I searched for a charging station, okay? Google Maps brought me to the backside of the plaza across the road and recommended I walk the last couple hundred feet. That to me is ridiculous. And yes, I know that it's predictive and I don't know, it just kind of figured I could do that, but come on, logic would dictate I punched in a fast charging location. I can't carry a bucket of electrons back to the car. I needed to be at the station. So I was a little bit irked to see that, whereas the built-in navigation gave me directions right to the charging station that I wanted to go to. Anyways, getting back to the stuff that even the base trim has. You got lane keep assist, forward collision warning with pedestrian detection, automatic emergency braking, blind spot monitoring, pretty long list of stuff. There's also a built-in Wi-Fi hotspot. Yes, that is subscription based, but it's still cool, especially if you've got kids. And then if you step up to this Premier trim that I'm driving, well, the list gets even longer. You got a heated steering wheel, ventilated front seats, heated rear seats. You've got adaptive cruise control as well, and then the ability to upgrade to that Super Cruise system. And once again, that really does set this thing apart. And then when you look at it overall, again, as a value pick, yeah, there are some ways that it comes up a little short, but dollar for dollar, it's really hard to argue with the value proposition here, and it just might be enough to make it worth overlooking some of the ways that this thing does come up short. To recap, I like the value the Bolt EUV offers, its overall accessibility and ease of use, and how smooth Super Cruise is. I don't like what the battery recall situation did to shopper confidence, the build quality issues I experienced, or the not so fast charging capabilities. Look, when it comes to my complaints about charging times, really not that big of a deal if you do plan to plug in at home overnight. Where you'll run into issues is if you head out of town, where you'll be stuck at charging stations a little longer than you'd probably like. Just ask me how I know. Otherwise, the big issue here is that battery recall, and I can understand any lingering apprehension it may have caused. But if you're looking for a fairly affordable EV with decent range and hands-free driving capability, this Bolt EV really is in a category all its own. So was it worth the wait? Well, that's up to you to decide. But if it were my money and I was shopping for an EV to use around town, I'd be giving this thing a serious look.